Hello, and welcome to Board Game Review with Jason. This is a video podcast where I usually take a game, show you how to play it, give you my personal review of it, and then give you some decision points so you can decide if it's a game you would like to try out. I say usually because I'm not going to do that in this episode. I want to use this episode as an introduction to the Board Game Review with Jason video podcast as a whole. Now, I've done 3 episodes before this where I looked at individual games, so you might be asking yourself, why do an introductory episode now? Well, as I started thinking about doing this podcast and looking at how to do podcasts and what's involved, the thing I kept running across was people saying to just get a few episodes out there, get your podcast started. And so that's what I did with the first 3 episodes. That's not to say that they were rushed, but I wanted to go through them and put a few out there and get a feeling for what it would take to produce these episodes. And also wanted to come up with a format that I could use for all of the episodes in the podcast. And I think I've settled in on a format, and so what I'm going to do in future episodes and the majority of episodes in this video podcast is to concentrate on a specific game. I'm going to show you what comes in the box, show you how to set up the game, go over the rules and the flow of play so you get an idea of what will go on during your turn. Then I'm going to give you my personal review of it, what I liked and disliked about the game. And finally I'm going to give you some decision points so you can decide if it's a game that you would like to try out. For example, I might say that for a particular game I didn't like it because it took too long to play. But you may like games that take longer to play, so the playing time would be a decision point for you in deciding if it's a game that you would like to check out. I'm going to give you a word of warning though. I'm not going to cover games such as Monopoly, Scrabble, Clue, other such games you can find at your local Walmart. And that's because these games are so mainstream and so common that you probably already know how to play them. I want to introduce you to some modern board games that will offer you some interesting new ideas and alternatives and way to play games. My hope is that you will find some new and interesting games to play so that when you get together and you want to play a board game, you'll have an alternative to pull out other than Monopoly and say, hey, let's give this game a try. It looked pretty good. So I want to use this introductory episode to go over 3 things. First, I want to share with you my personal journey into finding out about these modern board games and some lessons I learned along the way. The second thing I want to do is to go over some categories of modern board games and some jargon that's used, some words you'll run across as you discover these new board games. And so I want to get us all on the same page so that in future episodes when I talk about some of these modern board games, you'll know what I'm talking about. And lastly, I'd like to introduce you to an online community on the internet where you can go to discover some of these modern board games that I will talk about, as well as some that you may find elsewhere. So if you'll permit me, I'd like to go on and share with you my personal journey into discovering modern board games and some lessons I learned along the way. My earliest memories of gaming goes back to playing games with my grandma as a little kid. I remember playing card games with her and checkers. There was one unique game I remember playing with her, and it was called Tiddlywinks. And it was kind of like those games that you play at carnivals. It was kind of like that. You had a bullseye in the middle of the table with the bullseye worth so many points, and then you had concentric circles going out from there. And as you went out from the bullseye, it was fewer and fewer points. So you had a small disc, and you would put it on a piece of felt, and then you would get a larger disc and press down on the smaller disc on the felt and cause it to jump up in the air, and you try to get it to jump up in the air such that it would land in the bullseye. So you take turns doing that, and you would have several little discs in the bullseye, and you would take them all out and score up the points, and whoever got the most won. And then I remember a little bit later being at a cousin's house during Christmas time, and he introduced me to the game of Clue. And I remember even as a little kid I was intrigued by the theme of this game, a murder mystery where you're trying to find out who did it, in what room, and with what weapon. And the deduction aspect of it, as I later learned, I really found intriguing, and I really enjoyed this game, and it's all I wanted to play for quite some time. Then of course I got introduced to games like Monopoly, and then there was this game that the adults went into the room later on at night. Not that kind of game. It was called Trivial Pursuit, and I played this when I got a little bit older, but I never did quite very well at it because of the esoteric questions. Probably my first significant gaming experience came in middle school or high school, Axis and Allies. And I did an episode, I believe my second episode, Board Game Review with Jason, on the latest incarnation of Axis and Allies. But back when I was in middle school and high school, my friends and I, we were very interested in video gaming. And so we would get together on a Friday night and stay up to about midnight playing video games. And then he would break out this game called Axis and Allies. And we were really interested in World War II history. If you hadn't heard about this game, it's a World War II strategy game. But we would start playing around midnight, and before you know it, it would be the next morning. So we would play it on into the next morning for hours and hours. Like I said, though, we were interested in video games, and one of our favorite computer games was Sid Meier's Civilization. And I saw this board game by the same name, and it kind of looked like a Civilization game, and I thought it would be kind of similar to the PC game. But I soon realized it was not. It was a little similar, but not inspired by it, or not by Sid Meier or anything like that. And also the rules, it was quite a complicated game for me at the time, and so that experience didn't go over quite very well. And then one of my other friends got into the role-playing genre, and this is where one player will be something called the Game Master and will facilitate a gaming experience for the other players in the game. And the other players will go around as these characters in this fantasy world, let's say, and have all these different kinds of adventures. This experience didn't go over well either because we sort of got the feeling that the Game Master, one of our friends, was sort of learning the game as we went along, and so we spent a lot of time pausing and looking up rules. What are we supposed to do here? So that gaming experience didn't go over very well. So then my gaming sort of waned for the next few years through the rest of high school, and then I moved away to go to college, and so I lost that gaming group. I did come back and look at the Axis and Allies Revised Edition, which came out around this time, and I found it interesting, but I didn't have a gaming group to play the game with me. Besides the fact, I was very serious at this time with college, and I didn't really have much time to concentrate on board gaming. So again, gaming waned through college as I concentrated on college, and then I graduated college and moved. And so where I moved to, I sort of, I made some friends there, and one of them introduced me to a game called Settlers of Catan. And this is pretty interesting as I look back on it, because Settlers of Catan is one of the iconic games of modern board gaming. And so you would think maybe this is where my journey, my first hit in modern board gaming would be found. But it wasn't the case. This experience wasn't good at all either, because this friend, it was the way he taught the game to me. Instead of giving me, the rules and sort of how you play the game, and then sort of let me play through it and figure out on my own the fun that's there, he would sort of coach me as we went along on what moves I should be making and why the ones I wanted to make were bad. I didn't really like that style of teaching, and so this was a bad experience for me as well. So then my board gaming waned for the next several years again, and it really consisted mainly of playing party games such as CNET or Mad Gab or categories, but nothing really interesting. Then one day I was kind of bored, and I was looking through YouTube, and I just entered a search for board games, and I came across this video podcast on modern board games called Board Games with Scott, put out by Scott Nicholson. And I was really intrigued by the games I saw there. I had never heard of a lot of them, but they looked really interesting and offered some new ways of playing board games. I went to my local Walmart and looked around for some of these games, and I couldn't find any. And that's because most modern board games are not very popular right now in America, so you usually have to go to an online specialty board game shop that sells these modern board games, or find a local gaming shop called an FLGS, or Friendly Local Game Store. And that's what I did. I found the local one, and I went there and saw they had a couple of games that were on the Board Games with Scott video podcast. My first take from there was one called Carcassonne the Discovery. And this is a game where you would lay tiles on the table and the map board would kind of build itself as the game progressed. And you would put your playing pieces on areas of the map board in strategic locations to try and score the most points. I found the game interesting. I'd never seen where you would build the map board as the game went on. I'd never seen that kind of play in a board game before. So I found it interesting, but I couldn't really find anybody that was interested in playing it with me. My second take from this friendly local game store was a game called Die Macher, and this is a German political themed game. And the reason I looked at it is because it offered so many new ways of playing, and it looked really interesting. I could get exposure to all these new ways of playing. So I got that one, and it took me a while to learn it, but I really enjoyed sitting down with it and seeing the kinds of things that could go on. But then when I tried to find someone to sit down and teach it to and perhaps play with me, it didn't go over very well because it was so complicated. And then, it's hard to find someone with the patience to sit there for an hour or two learning the game and then sit there for another 4 or 5 hours playing the game. So then I was sort of wondering, these modern board games aren't turning out so well. So I went back on the Board Games with Scott video podcast, and he recommended an internet site called BoardGameGeek. So I went there and I started doing some research and came across this term called gateway games. And this was a category of games that are specifically targeted towards people who are new to modern board games. And one of the ones that was suggested most often was Ticket to Ride. I picked that up and shared it with several of my friends, and it was a hit every time we played. So that went over really well, and Ticket to Ride was actually my first successful game where I had good gaming experience with modern board games. So I'll stop right there. So what can you take away from my experience? First, I think it's important to reflect on where you've been. Look back in your childhood when you were growing up. What games did you play? Why did you play them? What were the good gaming experiences and why? And what were the bad gaming experiences and why? Second thing that I think is important to remember is that board gaming is a social experience. Video games are very popular right now, but when you get right down to it, it's really just someone mashing buttons or interacting with the TV screen, really, rather than with the other players in the game. With board games, you have people sitting around a table usually, and I find with board games there's much more interaction between the players as the game goes on. So I think it's important to remember this as a social experience, and think about who you're playing with as you select a game and see if it will be a good fit with your gaming group. Seek out advice from people who have already played some modern board games and what's successful to them. Tell them where you are in your journey and ask for some recommendations. And don't dive into the deep end first. Remember, there are gateway games. Try these games first because they are targeted towards people who are new to modern board games, and they have familiar rules. They have a small set of rules, and the way you play the game is familiar, like with cards or set collection, things like that. So that's my journey into modern board games, discovering new games, alternatives, and I hope you can take away something from my sharing this journey with you as you journey into discovering modern board games.